chain, which you can also do later, even if they're all on right now. So it's not really something you have to do at joint creation. So I leave those on. Symmetry, that's a new thing. Haven't worked with it enough, but I have noticed that when you turn it on and start to create joints, it actually has the channels of the mirror joints tied into something, which makes me nervous. It makes me nervous because if I actually want to use those channels via my controllers and use a constraint system on them, if they're already tied into something, I'm figuring we're probably going to run into problems. So I would avoid symmetry as well. It's actually quite simple to mirror a skeletal setup anyways. And indeed, when we create our joints, we're actually only going to be creating the left side to begin with anyways. Scale compensate. Okay, what scale compensate does is it basically says, I don't want you to scale every single child in this hierarchy when it's turned off. When it's turned on, if you, at least I think that's me. Sorry, they changed some of these settings to double check myself here. So if you scale this, yeah, turned on is the problem one. See how when I scale this up, it doesn't actually scale up the rest of the arm? That's because it's disregarding the children. Okay? So when you go to create this, I would actually leave it at what it used to be, which is with scale compensate. So if you need to scale up an entire joint chain, now you can. Now if I go and I create something, and I scale this up, see how they both scale? Ultimately, I think that's a better behavior. Auto joint limit, also don't recommend. It attempts to look at the angle you've drawn your joints and set a limit amount for what you're doing. We want to maintain as much control as we can, so we decide these things. So leave it off. Create an IK handle. We're going to be creating an IK setup. We don't need it to create an IK handle at the beginning. If anything, that would cause us problems. Okay? Variable bone radius setting. Can the visual display of it be big or small? Yeah, I kind of want to be able to size up or size down my joints, so yeah. Projected centering, that's my guessing where the center of your model is when you start to draw things. Generally speaking, automaticity can be a great thing. In this case, it tends to suck. We want to maintain as much control as we can of this, okay? So ultimately, I would just turn off scale compensate, I guess. Primary axis is the axis that is pointing down your joint chain. Primary axis is to bottom line it, the primary axis, the one that points down your joint chain, is going to be the axis that your joints twist with. So in this case, it would be X. If I'm drawing my joint chain out, what you will notice, if you look at the local rotational axes of this joint chain, is it will be X down, X down, X down, X down, X down. Which means that when I create my twist joint for my forearm, when I twist it like this, it would be the X rotation I'd be using to do. Okay? It's a pretty decent default. Secondary axis is the axis that attempts to point up. And secondary world orientation is just kind of the one that's left over. It just kind of kicks out. You can kind of not worry too much about secondary axis and secondary axis world orientation because they're ultimately just going to make that joint chain work anyways. I will also tell you this to put your mind at ease. There are no wrong settings on here technically. If you had Z pointing down your joint chain, it would still function. If you had X pointing up, it would still function. These things are, they're decisions that can be made that do affect behavior, but ultimately whatever behavior we get, we can work with. So we are not terribly concerned with what the default stock behavior is, because we can work with it just fine. Okay? And the rest of this, it's just kind of more of the same blah, 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 blah. I would even go so far as to say you don't technically even need to turn scale compensate on, because the way we're going to create joint chains, it's kind of irrelevant anyways. Okay, so that's the tool setting itself. Now, the thing is, let's just create a simple joint chain to begin with. When you create a joint chain, you're going to want to create it from an orthographic view. Top, front, side. The reason for that is, if you go and you try and create it from perspective, at least in 2013 and prior, maybe they fixed it, what happens is, it will set the initial orientation of your first joint that you lay down relative to the view you're looking at. Which means that if you're looking in perspective, it's just kind of pell-mell, oh, whatever. Okay? If you were in an orthographic view, it kind of has a sense that it needs to be aligned with the world. And it works. It just works. So, just as a course of habit, if you want to be safe, make sure you're in an orthographic view when you initially start drawing your joint chain. So, before I even get into the template, I'm just going to draw a fake arm here. Okay? Okay. Okay, so here's my arm. Now, I'm going to turn on local object orientation on my rotate tool here, so that my rotational axes correspond with the joints I just created. So you can use, in joint chains at least, you can use the up-down arrow keys to go either higher or lower in the hierarchy. So if I hit my down arrow key, I can jump to the elbow. If I hit my up arrow key, I can jump to the shoulder that I just created. Okay. Please no Saturday morning cartoons. So here's the thing. I want to impress this upon you right off the bat. Actually, can you just turn that off, please, or down, or whatever? Okay, so if we get here, I want you to notice, especially if I go to an orthographic view, the axes of rotation are actually pointing perfectly down this joint chain. You guys see that? That's awesome, right? It's almost like it was set up for us already, because it kind of was. Okay? Watch what happens if I move this joint. Like if I actually translate it. Here, I'll do something really horrible like that. Now I'm going to switch back to rotate. Oh look, it's still pointing down that joint. And its parent is not pointing the proper direction at all. It should be pointing at its child. It didn't change. So I need to impress this upon you now, because when you create a joint, the ideal scenario is that you create it in place and then you don't translate it at all. Okay? There is a slight exception with hierarchies that need to be moved into place. Some simple examples of this would be maybe the fingers or the arms, right? It's a little bit more necessary in the case of arms that are bent down or whatever, but it's enough for you to understand why we typically don't translate joints. It will screw up the rotational axes of your joint chains, and it will create excess data here we just don't need to screw with, okay? Ideally, our joints will have almost all zeroed out values and then solid ones for scale, right? Properly. The reason we always have to translate x value is it's actually the distance from its preceding joint, okay? That's the length of that bone right there. So that one's never going to go away, no matter how hard we try to freeze transforms. What else? No, I'm missing something here. No, oh yeah, I just remembered. Okay, so arms. Now the reason, max commands. Now the reason we don't have to worry too much about arms, because let's say we used a top view to create this, and we created it at the bottom of the grid or whatever. Now, because this is essentially the senior-most parent in the entirety of the arm joint chain, it's kind of its own boss to a certain degree. It may not be the most ideal in the world to have translational values on it, but because of its, how shall I put it? Because of its lot in life, for lack of a better term, it's actually acceptable in this particular case to have translation values. Not ideal, but acceptable. The ones that aren't would be the subsequent joins down that joint chain. You can kind of think of it as its own standalone skeleton. Other examples of that would be the legs, right? Essentially, the things that are going to get mirrored across the x-axis. Those things, the senior-most parent, before it ties into the spine or the hips, those can be translated. But we generally want to shy away from any like intermediate type joints. Okay? All right, so I find the best way to approach joint chain creation. First of all, I'm going to turn this to X-ray so I can see through it. I might turn wireframe unshaded on. Well, maybe not in this case. I'm going to leave it on X-ray. And I like to use a system of locators. And all these locators are going to do, because they're actually not going to be part of the functionality of the rig, what they actually are going to be points in space to which I can snap my joint chain creation at creation time. If a joint is snapped in place, it will be zeroed out. It won't have any translational data, right? The added advantage of having this locator setup is I can actually move them where I want them to be. Now, I usually show this the way I like to do it, but I've noticed that it tends to confuse people. So I'm just going to create straight up locators this time. What you want to do is you kind of want to find a spot that isn't going to flex too much for the root. So I try to find an area around the pelvis. Right? So right around that iliac crest is an excellent point in space because you really don't bend too much there, right? It's not going to crease too much right at that line. You do bend, but you know, we have to kind of choose our battles, so to speak, right? If that just doesn't sit right with you, you can choose a slightly lower point in line, even more so with the iliac crest, which is the bony ridge, incidentally, on the pelvis right here, in case you guys are lost as to what I'm saying. So I'm going to put this one here, and I'm going to call it what it's going to be. I like to use a prefix with my locators so that I never get confused as to what it is I'm creating. So in the case, in my case, anyways, I'm going to go T underscore root. And that's going to be my root locator. Okay? Now I'm going to create another locator. And I'm actually, instead of consistently going back to the create menu to create these locators, I'm simply going to create all the rest of them from this locator by duplicating it. It's just a little bit easier on my nerves. So I'm going to go Control D to duplicate. And I'm going to bring this one up. This one's going to exist lower than that root. This one is going to be the pelvis. This can be a little bit weird, but we must maintain an independent ability to rotate for the pelvis, or we're not going to be able to wiggle the hips without moving the entire body. Okay? The root is kind of our parent of everything, and the pelvis is going to be a child. All right? Now, the spine and the entire upper body is also going to be a child of the root. This confuses a lot of people, so just be aware as you're creating this. Just because something is down here, that is not the root. The root should be above. It should be above the hips or the pelvis. Okay, so I'm going to go in here. I'm going to label this one too. And this is something that's just good practice going forward. Is always labeling your stuff because it turns into a snowball of a problem if you don't stay on top of naming as you go through. If you need more incentives than that. Naming your joints and your geometry and everything else you create is actually one of the criteria you get graded on, both at midterm and at final. If I see anything that's called Locator 1 or Joint 05 or anything like that, you lose points. So in addition to it being good practice, save yourself the lost points. Label stuff. Call this pelvis. All right, I'm going to duplicate my locator again. I'm going to bring it up. I'm going to go to the side view here. I'm going to switch to shaded, switch this to X-ray, so I can see my locators. All right, so basically, joint creation, as far as rigging is concerned, is slightly different. Than it is in terms of anatomical understanding, and I've seen different people understand this differently as far as rigging. So I'm actually going to bother to explain it to you. If we were to put the spine along this back edge, which would be somewhat anatomically correct, the problem is going to be how the geometry gets weighted to the spine by default. What's going to happen is it's going to essentially radiate out its understanding of how this geometry should get weighted to those joints, and it's going to get confused the further away from that joint chain it gets. So as a general rule of thumb, when you actually create a spine for your rig, it is actually a little bit better to maybe err a little bit on the side of anatomy, but ultimately keep it a little more central, because it'll keep the weighting more balanced. It'll give you less work to do down the road. So I'm actually going to take this spine and I'm just going to bring it forward a little bit. The other thing we also want to keep in mind as we're going and creating these things is that we have enough edge loops that we can actually blend before and after these joints as we create them. So, cool. I'm going to duplicate it again. And here's the trick. Basically, we don't need many joints to create any kind of bend or any kind of functionality in that way. If I was to, hunch over like this, you can see there isn't a whole lot of flexibility. Well, that's granted, I'm not very flexible, but there isn't a whole lot of flexibility, at least as far as I'm concerned, in my ability to bend over and fold over on myself, right? So there's really no need to have anywhere near as many vertebrae as you would in actual anatomy. The idea is that you would choose the points at which you would naturally see any kind of bending and not overdo it. If you create too many joints, you have more to wait. So go easy, at least on the spine creation. So I'm not going to create too many spinal columns here, because I don't want to work too hard, because, well, I'm lazy. So I'm going to create like 1, 2, 3. And then the fourth one here is basically going to be in line with the arms, and it's where I'm going to tie in the arms, the clavicle, and everything else. Okay? I'm going to stay in this side view as I create it. You'll notice it still has the swoop of the back, but it's still a little more central. It'll actually give me a better result. I'm going to duplicate it again. Call that the clavicle area. This is going to be the beginning of the neck. This is the neck. And this last one is the head. I've known some people who also like to create just an extra joint here, even if they don't weight to it, right at the tip of the nose. The reason being, if you turn geometry off, you can actually look at that last point to get an understanding of which direction the head is facing. I'm not going to require you to do that, so we're not going to worry about it here. All right. So I'm going to turn off my polys for a second here, and I'm just going to take the opportunity right now to name these. So we're going to call this T underscore spine underscore 001. You don't have to have the underscore. You could have it just spine 001 or even spine 01 if you prefer. In fact, let's just do that, spine 01. Hit enter. Let's select the next one, spine 02. Next one, spine 03. Next one.
What did you name the first two again?
Root, because that's going to be the parent of all the other joints in the entirety of the hierarchy. This one's pelvis. It's below the root, and it's going to be what the legs tie into so they can wiggle. And then above the root is the spine. Okay, so spine 4. We also could have called this one sternum if we wanted to make the distinction. It's up to you what you call it. I might just do that just so if I'm looking at it in the hierarchy, I can know that's going to be that center point right at the top. It is a little bit of a cheat as far as the name is concerned, I suppose. I'm going to call this one T underscore neck 01 for what? Sorry. Okay. call this one neck 02. And I'm going to call this top of head, so I don't get confused. T underscore top head. Now, I do kind of want to point out the reason I called it top head, nothing that would bend or nothing that would be useful to me, is in joint creation, the joints you're actually using are all of the joints except the last one, which is a little bit bizarre. And part of the reason for that is all of the other joints, they understand their rotational axis. They understand which direction they should be pointed, except for the last one. The last joint you draw is kind of a termination point, and it will always be aligned to the world. So I'm calling that top ahead, so I understand it's the end of the line. And I also know that I'm not going to bother with it, or I'm going to use it to tie in my hair or something. Okay? Now I'm going to carry on.
What was the name of the locator underneath the root? The root locator?
Pelvis. You could also call it hips if you want. Okay? You're going to want your legs to be straight up and down too, just for easiness sake, because it'll make it much, much easier. Kind of like how I asked you guys to have the T-pose like this. If your legs are off to an angle, I should have covered that sooner, sorry. If your legs are off to an angle, you're going to have difficulty drawing them in a straight planar view. Whereas if they are straight up and down as this is, you can actually just go to a side view, create one, and get it over. Okay? That's the advantage of having something in the traditional sense lined up in a perfect T-pose. It just ultimately makes it much easier to work with as far as creating basic setups. So what I want to do is I kind of want to look at this grid to get a sense of where this is. So I can see that right now the middle of the leg is actually right here. But I still want to keep this somewhat central. So we have somewhat of a dilemma. And I'm kind of going to reach a compromise in this locator by favoring the far side over here. Okay? It's still going to possibly cause me a little bit of pain. Maybe I'll just shoot it over a little more. Now here's the thing to know. Even if your joints aren't perfectly centered in a limb, you can still actually weight to those joints. Ultimately, it's going to give you much better behavior if it is within the geometry around where it should be, right? Because if my leg is over here, my joints are over here, and this is still weighted to it, if that joint, if that knee is like up here or something, it's going to have a really hard time understanding how it should rotate, you know? If it's way the hell off in space or in some kind of weird way. So we want to stick close, but we're also not married to it. So if I come down here, you can see how we're a little bit off to the side. Yeah, we can actually still work with that by weighting this. Okay? So that's really not the end of the world. So I'm going to choose that as my hip point right here. I'm going to kind of try and still get it somewhat central as far as the leg is concerned. I'm going to try and offset it a little bit from this pelvis just so it's easier to look at. If you want, also, by the way, locators are somewhat like joints in that the visual representation you're seeing is completely and utterly pointless. These are actually nulls that have something that you can click on. They're nothings. They're nothings that hold a position in space and a rotational direction. The scale is almost arbitrary. If I froze transforms, it would go exactly back to what it started out as, right? So if you need to scale these to get a better, you know, if it's getting a little bit hard to tell what's what, you can scale them way down and it makes no difference. Once again, these are simply points we're going to snap joints to. So I'm going to have that start as the hip. I'm going to duplicate it, get it down to the knee, and I'm going to look at where the knee bends. Excellent. I'm going to duplicate it, and I'm going to get it down. We're actually not going to go down here. You would think that necessarily that this is going to be our next logical, you know, joint point or something, right? It's actually right here at the ankle. I'm going to choose it right there at the ankle. Maybe right there better. Yeah. We're going to duplicate it again. The next one we're going to create is the ball of the foot. And the last one we're going to create is the tip of the toe. Okay. So I'm going to turn polys off for a second here. I'm going to take the opportunity to name this. We'll call this T. This time, because we're actually on a side of the model, I also want to give it a name that is descriptive of it. So in this case, it's going to be T underscore L underscore hip, I suppose. Yeah, sounds good to me. Go to the knee. L underscore, need to stick with our naming convention. T underscore L underscore knee. We're going to go to the next one. It's going to be T underscore L underscore ankle. Go to the next one. T underscore L underscore ball. You can call these things whatever you want, by the way. You don't have to stick to my naming convention, just so long as it makes sense when I look at it, right? Okay, last one on here. T underscore L underscore tiptoe. All right, that's the leg. Let's get the arm in order. I take my fancy-dancy locator, create a duplicate. In the front view, we can have a clavicle right here. Ultimately, what it will do is it'll be in charge of shoulder shrugs. So the trick is to kind of logic out how that radius would work if you intend to include a shoulder shrug. I'm not asking you to produce a shoulder shrug for your model. The theory that we're going to use for all the FK in the entirety of this rig is going to be the exact same thing you would use for the shoulder shrug control. So if you get this going forward, it shouldn't be really all that hard to actually include that control if you decide to, okay? But if you want to put a shoulder shrug type control, what you need to do is basically consider the point you're doing, and this is kind of true for everything, and then look at where its subsequent point is going to be to rotate. So if it's here for the shoulder, right above this little crease, basically you can consider that a circle, because that's how it would move. It would rotate around this, which might actually be too stark towards the head, right? And if that's the case, you can move the clavicle over more towards the center line. And now, it would rotate like that. I have actually seen rigs, and it works, it's a little bit odd, where they will actually put the clavicle for the left side from the right side. So they get a much larger swooping angle when it comes time to make that clavicle work. Once again, you don't actually have to have it. I'm a fan of cleanliness, even though we are doing something that ultimately has to function. So I would say at most, just maybe something like over here. Trick is, if you get it closer to the top of this, that angle will be a little less stark because you have more circle to work with, so to speak, right? So we're also going to want this to be somewhat central, as before. So somewhere over here, perhaps. Okay. Now I'm going to duplicate this. And I'm going to use the top view and the front view to get this initial arm joint down. Now, the key here is we want our arm joint to be exactly like the leg joint in that we will create the entirety of it from the top view. And if your arms are in a proper T-pose, that won't be hard, because it should line up anyways, as long as the front view is in the right spot, right? So, the way I like to check is I like to pick a starting point for something like this, and I kind of like to cheat it out a little bit. If you use the plus, minus keys on your keyboard, you can make the manipulator grow or shrink, and you can kind of get an idea if that's a good center axis for your joint creation right there. Now, given how close it already is to the pit, I think that's actually pretty decent. It's kind of close to the top of the wrist over here. It's kind of close to the bottom over here. It seems to me to be a pretty decent compromise. Maybe a little bit more, just to try and get it somewhat more even here. And then you can just use minus to get it back to normal. I'll go back to the top view. Does that look central? Yeah, it kind of does. I'm going to duplicate it. Duplicate it. I'm going to put this one over where the elbow goes. Now, here's a tip on this particular model. This is not the elbow, because the crease of the arm is here. This is just bad modeling. Okay? So when you go to crease this, just keep in mind, you're going to look at where the arm is curving. Otherwise, you're going to get all kinds of weirdness over here. So let me change the view too, so you guys can see a little better. First one, second one. Last thing I want to make damn sure you understand is all joints that you create that are going to be hinge joints, which is to say the arm, right at the elbow, and the knee, they need to have a bend when you create them in the direction that they will bend. Okay? If they don't have that, Maya's going to get confused. So just make damn sure when you create your arm, even if it looks almost perfectly straight, just include a slight bend. Just even if it feels weird doing it, a slight bend. That slight degree of bend will be all Maya needs to set a preferred angle that helps it to understand how it should bend that joint. In our case, we're kind of golden here because it's like bam, bam, right? Okay, so whatever. So Control D. I'm going to bring this down to the wrist. Now, we are going to have a joint in between here. And in previous quarters, I showed people how I do it with locators, but I think their eyes glossed over for the most part. So we're going to handle it using the Insert Joint tool, okay? Which can be found in the same place you can find joint creation. If you go to the animation menu, skeleton, Insert Joint tool. Okay? It's also the joint tool if you don't want to click on the icon over here. You can find it right here in skeleton. Okay, so you would think that this is the entirety of our arm. Shoulder, elbow, wrist, right? But we actually need a center of the hand joint as well. So I'm going to duplicate this once more. I'm going to get it. It doesn't really matter. It could be over here, it could be over here, it could be over here. This is going to be essentially a dead joint. Remember, the last joint in our joint chain that we draw is aligned with the world. So we're not going to be counting on this one for any kind of rotation. It's just going to kind of hang out and be the point at which we tie in all the fingers. Okay? So that's going to be my hand joint. Fingers are a little bit of a debacle. So we're going to come back to those. So let's name these now. So this is going to be, actually let's, hang on. Let me just do this over here so we can get the clavicle too. So. Part of the reason, incidentally, why I'm taking such great care to name my template locators the proper names is because I fully intend to copy pasta all of those names into my joint chain, so I don't have to type it again. Because quite frankly, I'm lazy, and I like easy. So T L clavicle. Right. This is going to be T L shoulder.
What does the T stand for again?
Template. It's merely, the T is merely there so that when I actually name my proper joint, that can still exist in case I ever need to go back and do anything. I always have that there, you know, like a template would serve. And I won't, it'll have an icon, granted, but I don't want to accidentally think I'm doing something I'm not. The T just sets it off. Okay? T underscore L underscore elbow. This is going to be T underscore L wrist. Wristy in my case. Wrist. And this is going to be T underscore, oops, sorry. Yeah, no, I was right. T underscore L underscore hand. So that's my arm handled now. Let's handle the fingers. These are a little bit more nitpicky. Yeah, they're a little bit more. I half want to just say do this, and then we'll come back to it. Screw it. Let's do it now. What am I doing here? There we go. All right. So here's the trick. It's kind of hard to create the fingers if your arm isn't at the wrist somewhat aligned with the world. And the reason for that should become apparent if you look at it in like a top view. We could maybe use the pinky in this case. But ultimately, we want to choose something we can look at from an orthographic view for creation, and that we can then duplicate to create the other items. If they're all already at an angle, it's going to be quite difficult to get that in a straight line. If you don't get it in a straight line, your fingers are basically not going to bend right. So we want to have one template, basically, that handles that orthographically straight. Okay, in this case, I'm going to choose that one. The thumb is almost like its own limb, because if you look at the thumb, when you curl it, its natural state is to curl towards its own pinky. Okay? Which means that all of the planar rotations of these joints that are essentially hinge joints have to be at an angle to allow for that. That's kind of a pain in the butt, because all these other joints, they align with the world, they align with the arm. The thumb, however, we're going to have to either A, fix, or B, build it in to begin with. So just be aware of that as we're going. We're going to do the pinky, though, in our case. And once we have the pinky done, we're actually going to create the joints. And you're going to see why I took the trouble to do it this way. So I'm going to get this over here. I'm going to go to a front view. Ooh, that's kind of hard. It's going to be this one right here, though. And I'm going to scale this way the hell down, so I know it's a finger and it's a little bit easier to look at. So there's my knuckle. Control D. There is the next knuckle. And the fingers, by the way, are exactly the same as the knees and the arms, because also they are hinge joints, with the exception of the initial knuckle, okay, which is a socket. Okay. All right. So, if I take what I just created here and move it over, you can see I kind of guessed right. All right. So this is our joint template. Last thing I need to do is just name this guy. T underscore L underscore, in our case it's going to be pinky 01. Okay, just going to borrow that name. 02. 03. 04. Okay. All right, let's create some joints. And what we should have is the ability to select any given one of these from the side view without accidentally selecting the other. And if you look, the hip is offset from the pelvis. Pelvis is offset from the root. So there is zero danger in drawing it from here. The arm is another beast, however. We may simply want to throw all these locators onto their own layer, just so we don't accidentally snap to the wrong thing. So I'm just going to go create layer from selected, and just turn the visibility off temporarily. Call this arm template. All right, here we go. I'm going to turn geometry off. So I'm going to turn off polygons. I'm going to turn off the grid so you guys have an easier time seeing this. Okay. And if we need to know where to start, just click it till you find the root. If you can't remember the root, you can always just scale it up so that you do remember it. I'm going to double click my joint tool settings. I'm going to click reset tool. Actually, you know what? I'm going to leave scale compensate on. I do recommend turning it off, but let's see what the hell happens if I just leave it on. The answer is nothing, but here we go. To snap to a point in Maya, the hotkey is V. You have to press and hold V, and if you look up here, you're going to see that one of those little magnets is flashing just for all of you. You can also just turn it on up there, but I find it much quicker just to hold V as I do this. So I'm going to hold V with my joint tool creation on, and all you have to do is kind of get it in the ballpark, and it's going to snap to one of them. As long as you don't let go of the mouse, there's no problem. So, see that? Awesome, right? So there we go. There's my root. Release. Snap the next one. Snap the next one. and then you hit enter when you're done. The joint chain points in the direction of its children. You start off with this little sphere-looking ball, and then it almost has like an arrow, and where it gets skinny. The skinniest point is pointing to the next child. So in this case, if you look at it, you can see that the root is the parent of all these babies, right here, right? He's like the great-great-granddaddy.
You always start off on the root?
You start off in the root for the skeleton, for the spine, sorry. And that's going to be because, I think I understand what you're saying. You're saying you would always start drawing from there?
Yeah.
No. We're going to tie the other stuff back into the root. But we did need to create it. So, mission accomplished on that one. So, the reason we draw up, though, bless you, is because if the root was the littlest child, it would do what the head told it to, which would be pretty bizarre when it came time to try and make your character walk if his body was just flapping back and forth. It would be very bizarre. Right now, though, just so you guys can get a sense of it, if I deselect and then I select the root, I hit E to go to rotate, and I rotate it, see how all of the rest come along for the ride? That's kind of how our bodies work. If our muscles tell our upper body to bend, our root doesn't move. Our upper body does. So we have to consider our joint chain creation in that way. Who's the biggest daddy? Who's the biggest parent, right? In this case, it's the root for the spine. All right, let's create the leg. So actually, I'm going to scale this down. I'm going to skip the pelvis. The pelvis, I'm going to leave aligned to the world, FYI. So if you're wondering, why the hell didn't you draw it? It's because I actually want to leave it aligned to the world. So let's get this show on the road. This is the hit. So holding down V, snap, snap, snap. And that's actually the one we left at 000, so we're going to skip it right here. If you guys see that, it's kind of weird. We know it's weird. So snap, snap. All right, so there's my leg joint setup created. I turn off polygons. This one right here, that is the pelvis. So let's snap to that. Kabam. And all I'm going to do is draw one single joint and hit enter. Okay? So we got our pelvis joint set up. Let's bring our arm back and let's draw it up. We're not going to include the finger when we draw this, right? We're only going to end at the hand. Just FYI. So I'm going to turn the polys off. I'm in the top view. Get my joint tool. Actually, ooh, that clavicle might be a little bit of a bump. But the clavicle is right here. I don't know if you guys can make it out. But you see how it doesn't correspond with the leg? That's how we know it's the clavicle. So I'm just going to hold down V and I'm going to snap it there. Okay? And here we go. Snap, 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 snap. Enter. Now the arm is created. Okay? I'm actually going to go to a front view to create the pinky. Somebody have a question? Alright, let's create the pinky. Now, here's a little trick. The pinky is kind of going to be our everything finger. Okay? And there we are. Now, because we kept everything planar in the arm, if I go back to my rotate tool and I set it to local object, what I should see when I go down this arm joint chain is that this follows to the next joint. When it gets to the shoulder, notice how if we were, say, from a side view, the y-axis doesn't change until we get to that clavicle. The arm itself, though, it stays completely planar. The arm is flat except for that bend. That's what we wanted. That way it knows exactly which direction to bend in, and there's no confusion as to whether or not it'll bend in any other axis by default. This will help us when it comes time to create our IK setup, because IK is kind of stupid. What it will do is it will look at your joint chain, it'll look at the bend it has at creation, and it will say, oh, well, that's clearly the direction they want to bend. And it'll just go with it, right or wrong. if you've created a normal T-pose and you create it like this, you're going to be fine. Because essentially that joint chain from the shoulder to the hand is two-dimensional. Right? I mean, it's 3D, granted. But there's no variance in any of the other axes except for the top view. So ultimately, it can be represented in a two-dimensional way. Yes?
I missed the pinky. Did you start from the tip or from the knuckle?
Well, you're always going to start from what bends everything else. So let me ask you this. Does the tip bend the rest of the hand?
No.
That's how you know it's this way, right? Okay. So, the pinky, we can just straight up duplicate and start moving it to where the other knuckles are. If we turn on the wireframe, we can actually rotate this into place. And we want to try and match up the knuckles. We can use rotate to accomplish this. Some people will speak up against this as heresy, but it's actually just fine. Actually, it looks pretty close by default in terms of relation to the pinky, except it's a little less bent at this knuckle. So I'm going to use the down arrow key. I'm going to bend this up a little bit more. I still want to maintain some level of bend. I'm going to press the down arrow key again. Now I'm going to bend this one up a little less. Now you'll notice this finger is a little bit shorter than we need it to be. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use scale. So you hit the R on the parent joint here, and you can just scale it up a bit. Okay? Go back to the parent, go modify, freeze transforms. And what that should do is zero out the entire joint chain. Okay? Alright, so now we have our ring finger handle. I'm going to duplicate this one and move it over. And what I'm trying to do here is kind of line it up with the knuckle so that it bends somewhat in line. Then I'm going to use rotate to get this one in place. Alright, and I'm sure you might be getting a sense now of why I left scale compensate. Well, I should have left it off actually, but what the hell. Now it seems to me it's kind of getting a little bit low on this one, so I might actually have to go in here, raise this up a little bit, and maybe rotate it slightly upwards.
At this point, can you go back to scale compensate and just like turn it off?
I don't know, it's kind of a new deal. Yeah, you can turn it off in attribute editor right here, segment scale compensate, which is kind of handy to know for me too.